Well, welcome to the Winslow Art Center, Monday Morning Art History. And our topic today is Northern Europe in the 17th century. And because this is History Light, L-I-T-E, I want to give you a little bit of context and a little bit of lead-in so you can frame the artwork that's in this presentation. The 17th century, it was a very, very productive, progressive time in human history and in Europe, where, of course, we are focusing. But people often call it the age of the scientific revolution. And important figures included Galileo, Spinoza, and Rene Descartes. So all kinds of tremendous scientific and intellectual breakthroughs changed the basic understanding of the world and also led to conflict and chaos, especially in the century that followed in the 18th century. Europe was engaging the rest of the world and enriching itself through trade, exploration, and colonialism. And that was all the way through the Ottoman Empire to South America. And then the Dutch were also in Southeast Asia. And so think of this again as a very, very productive and maybe in some ways oppressive and conflicted era. And we're going to see the emphasis or the effect of science in many of the works of art and architecture that we're looking at today. You know that when I bring up maps, I just bring them up as a quick visual reference just to make a couple of points. So we're not going to go through this entirely, but a few things to keep in mind. The Catholic Habsburg family was still a dominant political force. And you can see that they are in charge in Flanders, what we now call Belgium. And we have a participant from Belgium today, I noticed in our webinar. Also in Catholic Spain and in southern Italy. There wasn't a Germany as we know Germany today, but there was a Holy Roman Empire, which was a kind of a patchwork quilt of various states. And because this was an era of conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism, you'll see that the political lines were often skewed along religious lines. So in the northern part of Europe, we had what was called Flanders and Holland, which of course is now the modern Dutch Republic. And turmoil had split these Low Countries into two nations in the 1500s. Flanders, think Belgium, was Catholic and royalist. And that's where we get these great artists, Peter Paul Rubens and Van Dyck. Their job artistically was to glorify Catholicism and the monarchy, often with grandiose and even overwhelming presentations and themes. And we think of Rubens in some ways, maybe as the first great movie director, if you want to think of paintings as movies, you know, ran an enormous shop full of assistants, could produce large numbers of paintings fairly rapidly. And interestingly, painting also played a role in diplomacy for Flanders. Rubens was a diplomat as well as a painter, and gifts of paintings to royalty became common. In the Netherlands, you have the development of a republic with a Calvinist influence. Dutch Protestants, including Rembrandt, who we talked about in the previous webinar, conveyed morality and sometimes subtle religious messages or moralistic messages that are there in the symbolism of all their kinds of paintings, landscapes, still lifes, and scenes of daily life. And it might be worth mentioning, I think I did during the Rembrandt presentation, but I'll repeat it, that Amsterdam was really the first great city of commercial art galleries because there was so much trade there. And you get the development also of standard types of painting, the seascape, the landscape, the still life, the genre painting, and these began to be exported all through Europe through trade. So I want to give you an example of what Rubens and his studio were capable of. This is a specialized commission that he did for St. Walburga in Antwerp. And you see that it's in the traditional format of the triptych of the three-panel painting with a crucifixion in the center. And there are a few things here that I would call strikingly Baroque. And by strikingly Baroque, I mean very, very dramatic or dynamic. And of course, the main Baroque element here is the figure of Christ himself being raised to crucifixion. And you can see that Rubens had looked at the Sistine ceiling. He'd seen the work of Michelangelo and had developed his own muscular figures. and the figure of Christ, nearly nude with the loincloth, is seemingly spotlit, a la Caravaggio. And he's at a diagonal, which is very unusual in earlier compositions. And he's seemingly being hoisted or, through straining muscles, being taken towards the vertical. And you can also see in the figures that hoist the cross, this kind of muscularity. One of the things that I think is so interesting about this painting is the commissioners. This was commissioned by a mariners' church. And so it was specifically made to appeal to people that worked on ships. And of course, what did they spend their days doing? Using ropes and hoisting sails and masts. And this almost has a kind of a maritime feeling through crucifixion. So think on that for a minute. Off to the side, you can see a different kind of drama. It's almost as if, for example, the figure of the grieving women on the left are pushed aside by the same diagonal that's in the composition. Blue tones of grief and despair on the edges. On the other side, you would see this kind of horse carrying the commander who's enforcing the crucifixion, and that's dynamic and violent and militaristic. And you can see how cleverly Rubens frames this extraordinary drama. So in this era, if you were a Catholic monarch, there really was just one studio to turn to if you wanted to glorify your reign. And Marie de Medici, I think you'll recognize the family she came from, the great Italian family, was actually a very minor figure in the history of the French monarchy. Her husband was poisoned, and she had a teenage son that was going to become the next ruler, but there were a few years in between where she was symbolically made the ruler of France. So I think you might call her a regent. But during this very, very brief period when she reigned in France, she spared no expense to tell her story. And when you hire the studio of Rubens, this is what you get. Here's the arrival of Marie de Medici at Marseille. So I'm looking at this and thinking, okay, a politician visits, a port city. That seems like a kind of routine political function. But look how it's portrayed and look at the levels in the painting. At the lowest level, even the nymphs, the sea nymphs, and King Triton are so excited that she's visiting that they are lunging out of the water. And of course, we've got these nude figures that contrast to the elegantly clad figure of the royal court up above them. And she comes off this kind of Baroque bark, this fantastic ship, walking on a red carpeting. And above her, gossamer angels that look like they're from a Tintoretto painting are blowing their trumpets. So that's a lot of ceremony for this one visit. But here's the amazing part. This is part one of just a whole suite of giant canvases. And you can visit them today, or maybe you have seen them in the Louvre, in the Richelieu Gallery on the second floor. I have to tell you that I saw them as a student in Europe when I was in college, and they were in Baroque style frames at that point. And because I was working for a frame maker, I remember the frames better than I remember the paintings. And I guess the Louvre was having problems with that. So now they are framed very conservatively. But I'm going to take you, if my internet is working properly, I'm going to take you to a 3D viewing website, if I can bring this up. And I'm going to try to give you a little the feeling of what it's like to walk in this gallery. And so when I said to you earlier, think of Rubens as, the first movie director, here are these, massively, massively scaled pictures, a whole cycle, a whole series. And I don't think this much historical attention had ever been given to a single ruler before. Maybe cycles of religious paintings that told the story of Christ, for example, or the Annunciation. Maybe they would have gotten this much attention. But here's the painting that we were looking at, and you get a feeling for the scale and for the grandeur. So this was a cycle of paintings that absolutely would knock you out. That was their intention. All right, back to keynote. Let's see if I can manage to move forward on my keynote. Okay, here we go. Okay. One more Rubens painting. And, of course, saying that conflict is on all of our minds. I know I spend a lot of time thinking about the problems of the world and what could you possibly do. And in the era of the 17th century, the way that war was presented by Rubens was an allegory. He compressed it to this kind of double-sided picture where he tried to illustrate not war or conflict literally, but the forces that would lead to war. So what we have the consequences of war here in a nearly 12-foot wide canvas that is in Florence, and it's a response to the 30 Years' War. And let's start with the left. On the left, we have a goddess who has, reaching towards the fury Alecto, and Alecto with her torch is a kind of a hag that represents the force of war. And her husband Mars is leaving her bed where there must have been, joyous sensuality just a moment before, and is being dragged into war. And we see another woman, a woman kind of leaning all over this diagonally as if she can't stop it. And we see cupids or children, hanging on to her as if they also can't stop it. So war has this incredible force, like a kind of a cosmic arm wrestling match where you're drawn into it and you can't stay out of it. And of course, another bit of symbolism, that explains how did this rage, how did this violence enter the world? The answer is the door of the temple of Janus has been left open. And I think advice we should give to all world leaders, don't leave the temple door open or the furies will emerge and will be dragged into war. Different subject matter. Here's another painter of this age, Anthony van Dyck, who traveled and did portraits of royalty. And I think this picture of the French ruler Charles I is the first painting I can think of that has what I would call a studied informality. Because if you want to think about the expectation of how royalty should be portrayed, especially in the 17th century, you might imagine that there should be a throne. You might imagine that the monarch should be higher up. You might imagine there'd be a kind of formality. But I think what happened here is that Van Dyck gave us, I don't know, I'm going to say a 17th century Ronald Reagan. If you remember that we used to see pictures of Ronald Reagan in Santa Barbara on horseback. Here we have Charles I dismounted, so his boots are touching the mud, and his horse is being fed, and the groom is holding the horse's neck and just hanging on to the gear and the bridle. And Charles looks at us with a certain knowing, haughty disdain. And I think the message is, yes, I'm the king, but I really enjoy a good ride in the countryside. Very, very different image of monarchy that I think has some political significance that makes the monarch maybe relatable for the first time in the history of painting. There's an incredible development in the Low Countries in terms of development of still life paintings. And the deep history of still life is some of the first ones I've seen, especially in Italian painting, tended to have the subject matter of the Last Supper. So they were depictions of communion, they were depictions of a church ritual. But now with the rise of Protestantism, you get, I'll call them secular still lifes. And yet, even when they're not directly dealing with religious subject matter, they've got that little sting of morality. They tend to give you some advice about the way to live. And looking at this magnificent painting by Clara Peters, Still Life with Flowers, a Goblet, a Dried Fruit, and Pretzels, I almost get the feeling that there are comments on different aspects of life and spirituality. In the flowers, we have spring and rebirth and freshness. In the dried fruit and the pretzels, we have something closer to daily life. And then we have that splendid goblet with the red wine behind all of it that says to me, I think there's still a hint of communion in this otherwise secular painting. But look at the reflectivity, the magnificent clarity that comes from Northern painting. That is a delicious painting, both visually and literally. The influence of Caravaggio had made its way from the south into northern painting. And if you look here, the calling of St. Matthew, of course, that's a subject matter that Caravaggio did so beautifully. And what has come from Caravaggio and his tradition is again, I'll use the word relatability, the credibility of the figures who seem to be drawn from everyday people, from street models, the way that Caravaggio would. There's also that tremendous contrast of dark and light. You know, we have figures in the shadow on the left leaning into the composition, pointing at Matthew. And I also would like to point out a really fantastic trompe-l'oeil detail. Look at the peeling posters on the back wall, you know, in that kind of gray toned light. Fantastic visual detail. But I'll say that the only thing here that really deviates from Caravaggio is we do get a different set of tonalities in the color. We have blue, we have violet, we have kind of a reddish pink. So the palette of Apelles, that simple palette of Caravaggio with so few colors, maybe 4 or 5 colors in each palette, is becoming richer in northern painting. A wonderful genre portrait by Gerrit van Honthorst. And I think the way to read this one, the way to enjoy it most, is to go from left to right. So on the left, we have a wonderful special effect in lighting. We have the feeling of a lantern or a candle that we are being blocked from by the figure in the foreground. And if you know the painting of Georges de la Tour, a wonderful French painter, he borrowed this and used this same effect. But so we have this feeling of a tremendous golden light that we are being blocked from. And then we follow that light, we follow it down to the right end of the table, and we see a man who is being fed by 2 women, a young woman and an older woman. And all of this is a source of giggles, you know, of mild hilarity to the people over here on the left. And of course, what we have is a lesson about one of the 7 deadly sins. We have a comment about gluttony, and everybody on the left side of the table gets to be a little bit judgmental and morally upright. They're able to handle their wine and their music, but the man on the end is going to fall down drunk and bloated in 15 minutes and is going to have to be carried home. At least that's what I think is coming in this painting. But what a masterpiece of dramatic lighting. And what an interesting use of a kind of amber yellow lighting, which I haven't seen before. It's impossible to look at Dutch painting from this period and not fall in love with the work of Frans Hals. And Frans Hals, in many ways, was a kind of a competitor or a peer to Rembrandt. He absolutely could do elaborate, well-paid group paintings, and we'll see one in a minute. But my favorites are what I call his wet-on-wet genre portraits. And you might call this wet-on-wet, you might call it alla prima, but these are paintings that are made very, very quickly. They're made with a toned ground, and that's a way of saying you don't have a white canvas, but maybe you have, in the case of the painting on the left, maybe you have an umber canvas or possibly a black canvas. And when you start painting, there might be a little raw or maybe thinned down linseed oil on it to make the canvas or the panel a little bit slippery. And you go in with wet paint on this toned, slightly wet ground, and you paint as fast as you can. And if you're Frans Hals, you get a fantastic sense of liveliness with very, very minimal kinds of methods. And if you want to get a feeling how quickly Frans Hals could paint, take a look at the black hat of the Jolly Toper, the drinker that's there on the left. And I'm imagining one big wide badger brush with a lot of ivory black. And think how quickly he could swoop in there and make that kind of oval that frames the face of the man. But when you see these in a museum, which of course is the place to see them, you can feel the active painting. You feel the freshness of the impasto. Look at the color on Malabebe. And by the way, Malabebe, she's probably, we'll call her a crone or a witch, because you have to be a crone or a witch to have a pet owl on your shoulder. And she has an enormous pewter tankard that's painted with real bravura. And she is really, really loving life. Look at that wonderful sneering laugh and kind of the joy that she's sharing with her whole inebriated situation. So these are unique in the way that a quick moving, spontaneous way of painting captured fleeting emotions and brought a new vitality to the tradition of portraiture. But here's what Frans Hals could do when he was in the, we'll call it in the Rembrandt zone. Here's a picture of the archers of St. Hadrian, so an archers guild, a military guild. And you know that when a painting like this was made, each archer probably came up with a good sum of money, maybe the equivalent of a couple of $1,000s or more in our money. And Hals had to be sure that he captured each one of them in a way that they'd feel like they'd spent their money well. So it has a little bit of a collage effect, maybe more than a dozen individual portraits where he, manages to tilt every head and fit everybody in and pose everybody so that they are very definitely part of the company. And maybe you paid a little bit extra if you were the commander or one of the, the seated figure in the foreground with your sash and with your sword. That took, I think, some extra work. But it's a tremendous portrait of the vitality of a group. And that's a Dutch theme. This Dutch theme of independence within a group, the ability to come together. You see many group portraits of corporations and guilds. It was a big part of Dutch culture then and is still now. And I have to start out presenting this painting by just saying I love this painting. I mean, what an astonishing, kind of sober painting of the women regents of the old men's home of Haarlem. I think the feminists who are watching today must be taking great joy in this painting because look at the character and the solemnity and the capability of these women. Not with lacy collars, but with starched collars and pink cheeks. Look at the woman who holds the key in the center, a triangle of stability and wisdom. And of course, you can see a ledger book. They hold their hands out. They make gestures even of intimacy, of touching each other's hands. And they do it all in this room where there's a painting within the room. And Amsterdam and Haarlem, great Dutch cities like that, were now full of art collections. And when you see history books, they have inventories of what did people collect in their guild halls, in their homes, in their city halls. So these women are managing money. They're managing the fate of old men. They have an art collection and they work together. What would you say? With a little bit of tension, but they work it out. A fantastic group portrait and a portrait of a different time in history. Here's Judith Leister, a very joyful self-portrait of her role as a painter. And you can see that she turns toward you, spinning that very, very elaborate collar that her ladies, her maids must have spent the morning ironing that just for the portrait, lace coming off the edge. And you can see that she's painting a musician who looks almost like a French painting, like a Watteau of a Commedia dell'arte figure playing the violin. And what confidence there is in this painting, and what confidence in lighting and in gesture, and also just in her capability as an artist. Wonderful, wonderful piece of painting in the lower right, where you see her fingers coming through the palette, holding a handkerchief, and then this wonderful array of brushes coming out of her hand, ready to keep painting. So we spent a lot of time on Rembrandt. And I don't want to over Rembrandt you, although that's a hard thing to do. But I have a few Rembrandts in today's talk just to give a few more thoughts about his greatness and about his range. The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulp is a painting that has inspired many generations of painters afterwards, especially the American Thomas Eakins. And it gives a feeling of the painter in a new role as an observer of science. So we see a medical lecture being given here, and we see the sense of a group portrait, but it's a group portrait where they are observing and they're being observed as this all happens. And you also can see the way that Rembrandt has made a kind of a circular light, as if he was in the room with a spotlight, taking all of this in. Fabulous portrait of a new attitude about exploration and science that I'm sure Leonardo da Vinci wishes he'd had this kind of scientific openness when he did his explorations. And finally, one thing that we always value in Rembrandt, empathy, compassion, humanity. And this is one of my favorite Rembrandts, The Return of the Prodigal Son. And because this painting has a great deal of texture, because it has impasto that glimmers and glistens, I think there's also a tactility about the way that the father touches his son's back and garment. And it's implied that the father is blind. So he's literally, kind of feeling this moment. And the emotion of that is highlighted as the good son who feels a tinge of jealousy, stands on the stairs and watches his father embrace the brother who did nothing but get into trouble. Fantastic. Rembrandt did something modern in his prints, if you've had the good fortune to see some Rembrandt etchings or lithography, and that is he worked through his prints in progressive states. And this is just one state of this very large etching, Christ with the sick around him. And if you look at the left side, you'll see that the figures there are mainly outlined with just hints of shading, maybe under a hat or behind the figure. And then as you go toward the image of Christ, Rembrandt uses aquatint and goes into full black. He goes into this kind of deep, engraving black with a halo scraped out of it. And then he goes into shadow off on the right side. So you kind of see Rembrandt's working method. You see what it was like when he just drew on the plate on the left. And then you see what happens when he dims the lights on the right of the plate and adds this chiaroscuro to printmaking. And there are so many artists who learned from that. One of them I can think of is Picasso. If you think of some of Picasso's drawings, he borrowed that Rembrandt technique of just making an outline and then partly shading. So you feel the sense of the process happening as shading was added sequentially. This has been called the golden age of Dutch painting. And of course, the gold, it's a metaphor, but it's also a color of light. Here in this view of Dordrecht, we see the church receding in the background, and we see the cattle and the milkmaid in the foreground, all of it bathed in this kind of crepuscular amber golden light that possibly evolved a yellow ochre, kind of a golden ground underneath the painting with glazes on top. And when I showed this painting, I like to tell a story that an art restorer told me because it says something about art and the role of art in our lives. A friend in Los Angeles had a painting. He had what he thought was a French painting that showed people drinking wine. It looked like an 18th century painting. And he told me he paid, I think, $25,000 for it. He paid a lot for this antique painting, not knowing who the artist was. And he took it to a restorer and he said, I think there's something underneath this. Maybe with cleaning, this will be a more valuable painting. Maybe we'll find out who did it. So I'd like you to do some cleaning. So he left the painting for a few months and came back. And the restorer, said to him, well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is there's a very complete, very interesting painting underneath this. The bad news is it's worth a lot less money. And what had happened is he had cleaned away this French painting of women drinking wine in a field, and it was actually a Dutch painting of milkmaids drinking milk in a field. And it would have had a cow in it like this. It was only worth about $5,000 because collectors prefer the women drinking wine to the women drinking milk. But anyways, I wasted your time with that one. Maybe I made you smile. The Dutch invented this skyscape. They were the first painters to really observe weather as a part of the practice of landscape painting. And of course, this was going to be exploited by other painters, especially the Impressionists in the 19th century. But look how low the horizon line is in this Van Rystel. Van Rystel being one of a family of great landscape painters. So you have that low horizon. 2/3 of the paintings are the clouds. If you're secular, they're clouds. If you're religious, they're the clouds of heaven. And this fantastic light raining down in patches on the fertile fields with tiny figures doing the farm work in the foreground. Again, the church in the background, letting you know where the center of town is. I'm going to say a couple things about Johannes Vermeer, and I want to start with a little bit of information that came from johannesvermeer.com. There's so much new information about him on the web, but it is more and more confirmed that Vermeer used a camera obscura to help design his paintings, to help observe his paintings. And if you don't know what a camera obscura is, it's an early form of projection where a very, very small hole is drilled, sometimes in a wall, sometimes in a box, And that light lets light in. If you do it just the right way, the right amount of light, and the right size of hole, you get an inverted projection on the next surface over, on a screen or on a wall. And research has shown us that there were these kind of camera boxes, these camera obscuras in the time of Vermeer. And of course, lenses were being developed. So there was, projection that was involved, maybe with a candle, maybe not. Sometimes you would reach inside one of these and there'd be a little tablet where you could describe an image. But at least in observation, it made a difference in the work of many Dutch painters. So when you see Vermeer's Allegory of the Art of Painting, which of course is a painting about painting, so again, we're observing the observer, we're seeing that theme again, you can see how carefully Vermeer charted the effect of light in this painting. And there's that wonderful, wonderful edge where the curtain opens up on a fully lit wall and then leads us towards the woman holding the instruments. And if it looks a little bit awkward that she is holding, what would you call it, a trumpet or trombone and a book, you want to remember that she's an allegorical figure, not a real woman. So she has the attributes maybe of poetry and of music, creativity, whatever you want to infer into this. And then, of course, there's the fabulous map in the background with its wrinkles that reminds us of the bigger world outside the studio, but still allows us to feel cloistered in this, very, very safe world. We think this was a demonstration painting that Vermeer made for himself, something that he kept to show his clients to say, this is what I'm capable of. Another wonderful Vermeer called A Letter. We're talking about an interesting point of view. We are seeing it through the broom closet. So if you kind of pull forward in the picture, can you see a mop hanging over a chair on the right side? You can even see some drips on the wall. It's an unkept, kind of a cluttered room. But outside the room, in the main house, where again there are paintings within the painting, we see the lady of the house, her lute playing has been interrupted to receive a letter from her maid. And is it just me, or is the maid maybe a little bit too gossipy and maybe a little too interested in what's in the letter? Maybe the husband's a ship captain and there's news from far away. We do have a seascape in the background with a sea and a bit of a storm with a ship on it. Maybe that's implying a little bit of narrative. But there tends to be in Dutch painting some kind of a moral implication or a narrative or something to take us a little bit deeper into envisioning the story. But we have to work at it. The Feast of St. Nicholas by Jan Steen, a little bit like the night watch for a family, a group painting of this wonderful moment where the kids are having to search all around grandmother's bedroom to find their treats, their dolls, the things that have been hidden from them. And we have the detail of the one brother who didn't find anything. So his aunt or his sister is saying, come on back here, look under this curtain. But it's a picture of the joy and the chaos of family, everybody gathered together, everybody characterized. And one favorite detail, how about the shoe kicked off in the foreground of the painting? And looking at that, I'm going to repeat what my sculpture teacher said to me in college. He said, if I ever do anything as good as a child's shoe by the edge of the freeway, I'll retire. That's poignancy. In this Vanitas, this still life painting with the theme of mortality by Peter Klaas, you can see the growing interest in lenses that we observed when we talked about the camera obscura. Look at that fantastic reflective metal ball or mercury ball that's on the left edge. And you can see the artist working at his easel, across this curved surface and, in a sense, looking towards us. And you can also see that the window frame forms a cross, which gives us a kind of a religious vibe in the painting. But across it, the passage of time is there in the open watch. The violin is put down. The goblet has spilled. The walnut is broken. The inkwell is pushed over. And the skull, which is, of course, the typical symbol of Vanitas, reminds us of the passage of time that goes with mortality. Bit of incense there in the back as well, with a hint of smoke. Even in this very, very grand still life, which shows us what must be a very, very wealthy person's possessions with a mineral countertop, a silk throw over that, incredible goblets that must have come from Venice. Even in that, Ming jar, right? Even with that, you can see the unwinding of the lemon peel. And that reminds us that there's a little bit of bitterness. There's something sour, even in the wealthiest of homes. And isn't that the truth? They have a couple of these Rachel Reich paintings at the Getty, and they're mind-blowing. Look at the way that Reich gives you both fresh flowers that are absolutely vibrant. They remind us of tulip mania, of the great Dutch interest in collecting and auctioning tulips. But we also see time passing in the blooms and the blossoms that wilt and fall to the base of the composition. Little bit of a greenish tinge in the background, not the usual umber that we're used to in a Rembrandt painting. All right, not a lot of time left, but let's put a few more things out there that you can research on your own in the coming week. Hopefully, I'm opening up, lots of thoughts for you. But in France, the authority of the monarch had been increasing sequentially, and in Louis XIV, France got a monarch who lasted, I think it was either 71 or 72 years, so the longest reign in French history. And Louis XIV modeled himself after Akhenaten, the Egyptian pharaoh who had been the sun king, who had worshipped the sun. And his emblem was the son of Apollo in the European case. And the palace that he built at Versailles is full of gold, the silver medal. There was a ceremony when he got up and went to bed at his royal bed, in the morning and in the evening. Absolutely an absolutist, and centralized ruler, greatly powerful, greatly influential. And he probably set in motion a lot of the inequality that would lead to the revolution 80 years after his death. Here's a wonderful allegorical painting by Poussin. And in this painting, three men have been wandering in the countryside, and they have found a sarcophagus, and there's a Latin inscription carved into it, et in Arcadia ego, which means, even in paradise, I am there, and I is death. So we'll call this a French vanitas painting, a painting that reminds of mortality. But in this situation where they, discover this kind of chilling thought for young men, a graceful young woman comes in and puts her hand on the shoulder of one of the young men. And how would you interpret that? You could say she's a very, very elegant figure of death. Maybe death is going to come early to one of them. But there are other ways to understand it as well. She may be a figure of poetry or creativity, because the impulse to make art, the impulse to make poetry, comes from the knowledge of mortality. So the shepherd who's there, his shadow is tracing his finger, and that might suggest the beginning of painting itself. From prehistory onward, the discovery of art has been our response to the discovery of mortality. And death's claim to rule Arcadia, at least in this one interpretation that I found, is challenged by the symbolism of the young woman. So it's another painting to be read and studied and argued about. And as I like to say, paintings don't come with instruction manuals. So we'll all have to discuss later what we think Poussin was trying to say. Here's a painting that has a historical root, and we see this often in Poussin paintings. The Burial of Phocion tells the story of a general who had been banished. He was an Athenian general who was put to death unjustly for treason. So he is resurrected in Poussin's painting, and just as he was honored posthumously, he was given a public funeral and memorialized. So in the foreground of the Poussin painting, his body is being taken away. It's a hero's body being removed, and he's going to be buried away from Athenian soil because he has been banished. So you can see that Poussin didn't just give us a classical landscape. He could have just given us a painting that took us back into the history of architecture, but he gives us a history lesson and a theme and a dose of bitterness, all in this one great narrative painting. And I want to say something about the composition. Look how clever that is, that you're kind of drawn from the left to the right, as we have been with many paintings today. And then the architecture and the pathways and the details tend to spread out as if we get something more expansive, like the expanding, lit path that's on the right edge of the painting. Something different emerged in the work of Laurent and later of Corot. The landscape of the countryside, the word's escaping me for a minute, but it'll come back to me. Here is this kind of beautiful, peaceful pastoral landscape. That's the word I was looking for, a landscape with cattle and peasants. And it's significant that we're not seeing a scene of Christ or of an Athenian general or of royalty. We are seeing the French countryside occupied the people who actually occupied it. And maybe it's the verdant French response to the Golden Age French painting we saw of the milkmaids, the simple life, the meek inheriting the earth. And what a wonderful atmospheric painting it is, with a sense of light on the low horizon and a hint of atmospheric perspective. And that's a way of saying that the colors of the sky draw us towards the horizon and give us the deep space of the painting. Yes, there was an increasing interest in subjects that were not royal, in subjects that weren't connected with the church. And the Lenan brothers were known for these genre portraits of peasant families. And here in this one, very, very dark in the background, but we get the feeling they're maybe lit by the fire you see on the left. There's a little bit of wine. There's a boy playing the flute. There is a man with a bowl and a wineskin in the center, a kid, stretched out on the floor. And you get the feeling that there is a certain comfort in this household, along with a kind of a stiff poverty. We're given, both realities in one painting. Callot, in a series of etchings, The Miseries of War, was maybe what you could call the first documentary filmmaker. Made a whole series of these etchings that were distributed that tried to give people some of the realities of what happened in war. In this case, a mass hanging from a tree. But printmaking was a great way of multiplying the image before photography. And of course, Goya would be inspired by this series. Georges de la Tour, using that fantastic lighting that we saw earlier in the Dutch painting. And I once had a student say in my classroom that it looked like the infant Christ was a plugged-in lamp in this painting. And that made me laugh at the time, but it's kind of true. You almost get the feeling like the light source, the lantern for the painting, is the little wrapped up Christ figure with a lamb nudging its nose towards that figure. And what a beautiful piece of painting. In the center, just to your right, look at the hand, that's shielding us from the candlelight. And the hand is painted in deep ivory black. So it's a really, really unusual thing to have a black hand in a painting, but it shields us from that light with a highlight on the thumb. Louis XIV, I'll just say a few things about him. He had a perfume factory that made a different aroma for him every day of his life. That's a fact that I enjoy. Yes, he wore high stockings, as the men in his court did, and wigs. And if you're looking at his red high heels, the story goes that early in his reign, there was a duel that he attended as a witness, and he stepped in blood at the end of the duel, and someone insulted him. And they said, Louis, it looks like you have some blood on your shoes. He took offense. And the way that he showed that he was not embarrassed was he wore red shoes most of the time after that, as if he had stepped in blood and was comfortable with that. This was a great period of building. The expansion of the Louvre was a great project where you get this, I call it kind of horizontal skyscraper of the east facade of the Louvre. And this has a new innovation. It actually has metal stress bars that go from the central building out to the colonnade and hold it all together. And it made these great exterior hallways with double columns possible. So we have, engineering breakthroughs. At Versailles, where you have a 7-mile long garden behind Versailles. This was a project that took many years, built on a hunting lodge that Louis XIII had established. And I'll tell you one thing about Versailles that says something about the era. Apparently, there's something more than 20 fountains operational now at Versailles, all these magnificent water fountains. But as Versailles was being built, the engineers realized they really only had enough water pressure, even with everything they were doing, to run 3 or 4 fountains. But nobody wanted to tell the king. So they would, they had a series of people that were on the grounds watching for the king's carriage when he was out and about, and they would turn on the fountains he could see. When he ran around the corner, they would turn those fountains off and turn on the next one. So through his whole reign, Louis XIV never knew that there wasn't enough water for all the fountains. And I think that's how they ran the economy as well with this very expensive building program. I mean, imagine meeting the king in the Hall of Mirrors, with these silverback mirrors, where he would wear a 69 karat diamond called the French blue on a ribbon around his neck and meet you in silk stockings. I mean, the kind of glamour and reflective intensivity of the situation, I don't think has ever been equaled. And of course, that's where the Treaty of Versailles was signed after World War One. You can wander in the gardens today as a tourist or rent a bike and see a grotto like this, where Apollo, who of course is a stand-in for the king himself, the symbol of the Sun King, is attended by nymphs. What a fantastic kind of French Playboy fantasy that is. Versailles just kept being expanded with royal chapels like this one that took 12 years to build. If you have visited the Church de l'Invalide, it shows you the ambition of Baroque French architecture because it was such a grand conception that it was never finished. And you see really what would have been the heart of a basilica with this fantastic gilded dome, 17 pounds of gold gilding the dome, by the way. And you see that they never extended the hallway outward. But when you visit, as I bet Martha and her groups probably have, you can see the 7-layer sarcophagus of Napoleon in the basement. And it's the first place that Hitler wanted to visit when he came to Paris, in a chilling trivia fact there. In Britain, you see them trying to catch up with the Renaissance by looking at the work of the great Venetian Palladio. Inigo Jones Banqueting Hall certainly has, the echoes of Palladio, but it's flatter. And the columns have mainly been reduced to pilasters and flattened. They didn't quite have yet the feeling of depth, but they did borrow the great sense of order. And finally, really the greatest church of the 17th century, the new St. Paul's, designed by Sir Christopher Wren. And Sir Christopher Wren, I mean, what a story that guy has. He was a friend and a correspondent of Sir Isaac Newton. And he built this historic, incredible ringed dome. One thing I want you to notice about the dome as you look up is you can see how there is a ring supported by a colonnade that lifted the whole dome upwards, and then a cupola on top of that. And they succeeded in making towers with cupolas on both sides and clock towers, which of course we know that Bernini failed at when he built, when he gave his proposal for the towers of St. Peter's, but they must have more stable ground in Britain. With my video not working, I had a 2-minute video of St. Paul's, but my sound not working. I think I will skip that and get back to Martha. I'll mention that we're going to see you on October 7th. We'll head into the 18th century and do another one of these art history light presentations to open things up to you. And let's go back and find out your thoughts and your questions.